How's it going, guys? Super quick, exciting announcement. Tomorrow morning, Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm going to be doing a live stream partnered with Live.me on their platform where I teach some street photography, show you guys how I do it in action, and then do a little bit of a Q&A. It should be a really good time, an hour long, Sunday at 12 p.m. You can download the app by hitting the link in the description and be sure to follow me ahead of time. My username is right here. Anyway, back to the scheduled programming. How's it going, guys? I'm Josh, and today I have a very exciting video for a very exciting camera. This is the Nikon D850, what some people might call the smartest move I've ever made in my life, and others might say is crossing over to the dark side. I have been using a Canon camera my entire life, and this is my first Nikon camera I've ever tested out. So today I'm going to be reviewing it. I took it to Israel on a 10-day trip where I tested it out with street photography, landscapes, and portraiture. So today I'm going to be talking about what makes this camera so great, what I don't like about it, why there's all this hype around it, and the features that people are fawning over, all under the frame of a Canon user's first time trying out a Nikon. Now, even if you're still a beginner photographer, my goal with this video is to explain everything very simply so you can understand. The reason being, the more you know about gear, the better a photographer you can be. And a lot of these concepts I'm touching on apply to lower level cameras and not just this $3,300 beast. So I have three goals for today. One is to talk about this camera, explaining what makes nice, expensive cameras so great and if it's worth it for you. Two is to explain a lot of the terms that are commonly used for reviewing cameras so that when you want to look up online reviews in the future for other gear, you'll be able to read it and it'll make more sense to you. And three is to show off some sick Israel photos I took because I've got a lot of them and they demo the camera. Now, before we jump into this, I want to just give a quick preface. Actually, let's call it a preamble. That sounds way cooler. So first, I do want to just disclose the fact that Nikon did lend me this camera as well as a bunch of lenses to test out. Second, I want to talk about brand loyalty a little bit. People are very emotionally attached to their camera company that they've been using their entire lives, and also financially attached, having bought a bunch of lenses, and it's expensive to switch from camera company to camera company. Now, that being said, this D850 is at the top of its game right now. In many ways, there isn't a Canon camera that can match this. Some might say there are Sonys out there that do. Now, that being said, that does not mean you should immediately jump ship just because it's a better camera. Camera companies are in a constant game of leapfrog with each other, Nikon having pulled ahead of Canon right now with this D850, but who knows what Canon can come out with next. This might be wishful thinking, but a mirrorless camera that could use its current lens lineup, that would be absolutely phenomenal. And lastly, whenever you're camera or lens shopping, don't be swayed by beautiful example images. It's more about the photographer than the gear itself. And I'm about to grossly contradict myself by showing tons of Israel photos, but I figure it's better than looking at my face this entire time. Anyway, let's jump into it. Now, first of all, let's talk about megapixels. And you've probably heard this before, but this camera is 45.7 megapixels, which is insane. Now, what does that mean and why does it matter? So first of all, in comparison to the current camera landscape, most other cameras are in the 20 and 30 megapixel range right now, so 45.7 is pretty significant. Now, it's actually verging on medium format sized images, and medium format and large format cameras take much larger image sizes. And this is verging on that, yet it also can still use full frame camera lenses. Now, one of the main limiting factors of medium format cameras is the fact that they have limited lens selection. So to have a very high megapixel count DSLR is huge because you have all these great lenses that you can still use for it. People like higher megapixel images because they are larger files with more information in them, which means you can print them larger and crop them more while still having an acceptably large file. Now, if you're doing commercial work, every megapixel really matters when you want to blow up your photo to be in a billboard. Me, not so much. I really just do medium-sized prints. So it's really the cropping where this becomes super beneficial. Because it's such a large file, I'm able to crop it much more than I normally would be able to and still have the file be acceptably large for prints. Meanwhile, with lower megapixel images, I've run into this issue where I crop down the image to where I want it to be and it's just too small to print it to a certain size. Now, too small is a very arbitrary term and it just depends entirely on what you're doing with your images. So if you're only shooting for your website and maybe Instagram posts, it really doesn't matter. But when you're printing out your stuff, that's when file size really comes into play. Now, another cool thing about these large files is that they allow me to shoot a little bit looser. And what I mean by that is before, because cropping was kind of an issue, where I'd lose too much information, I wanted to frame the image exactly how I wanted to frame it without giving any extra leeway on the sides. Now I can shoot loose. And what I mean by that is just shoot a little more zoomed out than I normally would because I can just crop in a little bit. Now this isn't a crazy dramatic change. It's not like I'm just cropping the image in 10 times, but it does give me a little more flexibility, which is great. Now a quick warning, you should never rely too heavily on cropping in post because I feel like it can make you become lazy with your initial composition when you're shooting the photo. However, it is nice to have a little extra leniency with this camera. Chocolate break. One small pseudo downside to all of this is that these files are massive. When you're shooting in full quality RAW, then they're going to be between 50 and 60 or so megabytes per image, which is huge. And my computer, which is 4 years old, does struggle and slow down quite a bit sometimes when I'm trying to edit these shots, which it hadn't before with my smaller sized camera photos. However, you can shoot smaller photos if you'd like on this camera. There's a plethora of options, so you definitely have that option if you'd like. Just a fair warning, it's nice to have a properly equipped computer if you're going to be shooting such large images. And number two, let's talk about video on this bad boy. So this is really where the D850 stands out in that I feel like it is normalizing the high megapixel DSLR. So Canon has the alternative. This is the 5DS and the 5DSR, and these are 50.6 megapixel cameras if you really want a high megapixel Canon alternative. Now here's the issue with these two guys, and to be fair, they did come out 2 or 3 years ago, I believe. But these cameras have 1080p video only, no 4K, only 1080p at 30 frames a second. And if you want to shoot 60, which I really like doing for slow-mo and skateboarding, then you can only shoot at 720p, which is mediocre HD at best. Whereas the D850 can shoot at 4K and 1080p 60 frames per second. So it's basically the 5DS and the 5DSR are kind of like niche cameras that maybe aren't the best for action stuff. However, the D850 now has all of this well-roundedness of a high-tier camera and none of the short sides of being like a niche high megapixel thing. It's just becoming like a normal feature on a camera, which is really, really cool. And I'm really excited to see what Canon makes next in response to this. All numbers aside, essentially this camera is the end of making trade-offs to have a high megapixel count camera. You can now have it all, which is a really neat thing. And number three, let's talk about the tilting monitor, which is pretty awesome, but I do have some qualms. Now, at the risk of sounding like the kid who doesn't know when to stop asking for later bedtimes, let's start with what's awesome about this feature. So it is very sturdy, and it's touchscreen, meaning I can get low to the ground and shoot photos without having to lie my entire body in the dirty New York streets or a pile of mud just to get a good photo, as you have to do when you don't have a full-belt LCD screen on most cameras. However, this only holds true when you're shooting in landscape orientation, because when you go into portrait mode, you kind of lose all the benefits of it. Now, for the full frame and mirrorless camera landscape, this is remarkable. While this feature is commonplace on a lot of crop sensor or entry-level cameras, it's almost unheard of in these professional grade cameras. So if you need a DSLR with a tilting screen, this is the best one on the market right now. However, I really do love Canon's vari-angle LCD screen, and what that does is not only does it tilt out, but it also swivels. So you can do not just for shooting landscapes and reap the benefits of shooting high or low, you can also shoot portrait-oriented photos and still be able to hold the camera lower or higher and be able to see the screen, which is huge for two reasons. One is the portrait photos, and two is as a YouTuber that does a lot of self-filming, being able to compose a shot with the camera facing my way is really huge, and I just can't do that with this camera. Which is why I use Canon's 6D Mark II, which I believe is one of the only full-frame cameras that has an LCD screen that tilts and swivels and dances just how I like it to. The 6D Mark II is also much cheaper than the D850 at a price point of $1,900 or so right now. Now I should also point out that Nikon does have a cheaper full-frame camera that also has a tilting LCD, and that is the D750. However, it does not tilt and swivel, it only tilts. And that's also, I think, $1,800, same price range as the 6D Mark II. Now I should say I don't think I deserve a shoulder to cry on for this lacking feature, because most people that use this camera are going to be professionals and they might have something like an external monitor or crews to help them out. It's a unique situation that I'm in, so I can't really complain about this. And the fact of the matter is, it is a very unique feature for such a high-grade flagship camera, so I'm stoked in many ways. And number four, let's talk about design. So one thing I really like about the D850 is the grip. It actually has a more pronounced area between your pointer finger and your middle finger, so when you're holding the camera, it feels like you have a little more stability and balance in it than with most of the Canons, which is a little bit less pronounced. Not a huge thing, but just a minor little detail that I do really like. Something I don't like as much is the dial. So Canon always has these nice spinning dials, which are phenomenal, and Nikon has this guy, which doesn't quite do it for me as much. It's not quite as slick, just doesn't feel quite right. And maybe that is my Canon bias coming into play, I'm not entirely sure. And now for internal design. Now I should acknowledge the fact that there are ways to program your camera to work around any qualms you might have with the initial design, but it's still worth acknowledging the default settings. So one thing I really like about the Nikon is that there is a switch. When you hold down ISO and you flip the aperture button, then it automatically changes to ISO auto back and forth. Now, someone who uses ISO auto a lot when I'm doing street photography, this is huge. And Canon, I actually have to spin the wheel all the way around to get back to auto, which is right next to ISO 100. Now, another small feature that Canon automatically has is when you're in playback looking at your photos, you can use the shutter speed dial to skip ahead 10 images at a time, whereas Nikon does not have any sort of default feature like that. Now, you can go in and program it, so it skips 10 or 50 images at a time, which is neat. But if I were Nikon, I would just have that feature automatically implemented. Small detail though. And number 5, I want to talk about colors. Now, one thing you might hear photographers talk about between Canon, Nikon, and Sony are how the colors change. And some people say Canon colors are magical. I hear that thrown around a lot. Now, in the past, this may have been true, and many people would swear by the fact that skin tones looked better on Canons, yada yada, landscapes, whatever. Everyone has their own theories and preferences. However, I think that this difference has really been kind of smoothed over the last few years, and my experience with the D850 is that the colors are lovely. And of course, anything that wasn't quite the same, Canon does shoot a little bit warmer by default, you can fix very easily in Lightroom just by shooting RAW. And by putting this white balance into cloudy, it also just made the colors much warmer. And as much as I love perpetuating super niche conspiracies, I'd say this was a non-issue for me. The colors were just fine on this. And number 6, let's talk about focus peaking. This is probably something you've heard about. It's a very cool focusing feature in which a bunch of pixels light up on the screen showing what area of the photo is in focus. So say I put my hand right here, it would put a bunch of yellow dots on my hand and you know that that area is in focus. Now this is something that Canon by default does not have. Instead they have what they call dual pixel autofocus, which is essentially a fancy way of saying very fast focus. Now I'd say both of these cameras are incredibly fast focusers, but I really did enjoy using focus peaking because I found it's the most visual way to really control the focusing yourself, especially if you have a lens that doesn't have autofocus on it, then focus peaking becomes really important. Now, Canon does not have this. However, they do have, if you download Magic Lantern, which is an external software to override Canon's internal software, you can download it with Magic Lantern. So it's a feature you can kind of rig on a Canon camera. It's very nice to have this by default on a Nikon. And number 7, let's talk about what I'm comfortable saying is my favorite feature of the D850, and that is silent shooting. Now, you might think, silent shooting, doesn't every camera have that? Yes, most cameras do have that. This camera has what they call silent shooting, but the fact is, it's not silent. It's just a quieter version of shooting, but you still hear the shutter going up and down, and it's still fairly noisy. This D850 can actually do silent shooting, which is incredible. It shoots at 6 frames per second in full resolution images perfectly silently, and what it's doing is it's using an electronic shutter to do so. And that is game-changing for me because for things like street photography, now I can actually photograph people without them noticing, which is huge just to get a candid moment. It's also great for stuff like weddings where you don't want to distract people, or plays, theater, any sort of performance. This is a really phenomenal feature that is normally only present in mirrorless cameras. So it's pretty incredible to see this in a DSLR, and I'm stoked on this. I really wish my Canon had this, I can say that. Pains me to say it, but I can say it. And number 8, a very cool new feature for this camera is the automatic focus stacking. And what this is first of all, focus stacking, if you haven't heard of it, is when you take a photo at many different focuses, so you can have every aspect of the photo in focus, and you combine them all later in Photoshop. So normally to do focus stacking, you have to kind of painstakingly just keep adjusting the focus and keep shooting photos until you have the range that you want. Now, the Nikon D850 can actually do this automatically. So what you do is you go into the camera's focus shift shooting menu. You set the number of shots you want to take and the range of focus that you want, and then it automatically just bangs all of them out, which is really awesome because it means you don't have to touch your camera at all to keep it super steady and do that. Now, unfortunately, even though they call this automatic focus stacking, it doesn't actually combine them all in camera, but it makes the shooting significantly easier, and then you can just go ahead and do that all in Photoshop. And if anyone's curious about this method, I am meaning to do a photo tutorial on this, so keep an eye out for that very soon. And finally, number 9, I'm not sure if I saved the best for last. It's fairly trivial, but also really, really important, and that is the backlit buttons. Now, the Nikon D850 has this awesome feature where when you snap your camera, you can go one past the on mode, and suddenly all of the buttons on the camera, not just this panel right here, but all of the buttons are illuminated, which is huge, especially when you're shooting in the dark. Like when I'm doing astrophotography, I normally have to use a headlamp, but I think this solves that problem, which is amazing. Whereas with a Canon, you can only light up this area right here. And this is one of those trivial things that I imagine will become commonplace very soon. In fact, I know that Canon has actually filed a patent for backlit buttons back in 2017, so keep an eye out for this. It'll be commonplace in the next year, I guess. After talking about all these amazing complex features, it feels pretty anticlimactic to wrap it up talking about buttons and lights, but that's where I'm at. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my Nikon D850 review. This is actually my first ever camera body review, so hopefully you guys enjoyed this, and let me know in the comments how I can improve, what you liked about it, or just any thoughts. If you want to talk some smack, feel free to do so. I always get a kick out of that, and constructive criticism is important. Anyway, a couple last things. If you want to check out this camera and buy it, I'm going to put links down below to Amazon. Also, if you enjoyed my photos from this video, then definitely feel free to check out my Instagram and hit me with that follow. And lastly, if you enjoyed my photos so much that you might want to get a print of them, you can do so on my website. Links to that right over here. So guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you Nikon for this awesome opportunity, and thank you chocolate makers of the world for fueling this video. Anyway guys, that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you eventually.